I worked for Kenny Monfort's company in the late 1970s and always recognized him as a very unique individual. And it was an exciting company. And so when the opportunity arose to write a book about him, I jumped at it. I felt if I was going to write a book of any sort, this would be the book I'd like to write. Kenny was unusual. He was not a typical businessman. He wasn't a typical human being. He was just, he was an original. One of the stories that kind of led to the name of the book, Kenny's Shoes, was the fact that he went to a very important political function, and he was wearing two different shoes, a brown loafer and a black one. And when it was brought to his attention, he said, "Oh, it's nothing. I'm sure I have another pair just like it at home." But he just didn't care really about the way he dressed. Kenny's grandfather moved to northern Colorado from Illinois. He was a farmer and thought he'd have a lot better opportunity in northern Colorado. Always wanted to move out west, so he did, and found it to be to his liking, and brought his family with him. And one of his family was his son, Warren. He started the feedlots back in the Depression in 1930 after his father had died, and started with a pen of cattle, 18 head, and was very successful at it. He found that when he could feed cattle year-round, he was selling cattle when packers most needed them, and he could make money at that. Kenny never really was going to go into the cattle feeding business. He had other things on his mind when he was growing up. It was his older brother, Dick Monfort, who was going to be the cattle feeder in the business. He was being groomed for it. Unfortunately, Dick was drafted during World War II, went into the Army Air Force, and was shot down over Germany towards the end of World War II. And obviously Kenny was drafted himself, so to speak, into the family business. In the late 1950s, Kenny and Warren decided that it wasn't very efficient to ship their cattle all the way to Chicago or to Omaha and sell their animals there. They tried to convince packers to move out to Colorado so that they could have a more local place where they could process their animals. They couldn't get any of the big packers to agree to come out to Colorado. So they worked a deal with a Denver packer to start a packing plant near their feedlots in Greeley. And that lasted about 6 months. And the other group moved out, and the Monforts were all of a sudden packers. There were a lot of struggles early on in the packing plant success. There were several times when it faced bankruptcy. And he would always go to the bankers and beg for a few more weeks, a few more months to keep it going. And a couple of times had to go to the employees and say, you know, I'm not sure how long we're going to be able to keep going. So it was a struggle. They weren't a packing operation from the 1920s. They were learning as they were going, and they had to figure it out as they were going. And that did lead to some problems and some challenges, but they would continue to come through and get to the next level. By 1968, the Monforts had become the biggest cattle feeders in the world. Their feedlots were 100,000 head, and sometimes they'd fit a few more than 100,000 into that feedlot. And then in 1970, they started another feedlot south of Greeley, which was another 100,000 head feedlot. So at one time, they were able to process or were able to feed more than 200,000 head of cattle at one time. I think the biggest thing that Kenny Monfort did, and his father Warren, was that he wasn't afraid of change. He embraced change, and he wasn't afraid of taking a chance. And I think people saw that and said, you know, he's not afraid of change. Maybe we can embrace that too and take some chances to be successful in our own businesses. And I think that's what they did for the industry, was they helped it really get started in the 1950s and 1960s to be different, to make changes, to take chances, and to come up with better products, to raise better animals, and to serve consumers better with the beef that they have. Kenny will be remembered for his business acumen. Unfortunately, the Monfort name does not live on in the packing industry. He sold in 1987, and that's gone by the wayside. But the people who remember Kenny and the people who will read my book, they'll know that he really was one of the pioneers in the 1960s in the meat packing industry, and that his father Warren in the 1930s was one of the pioneers in the cattle feeding industry, and that the family really made a huge difference in the beef industry as it was getting its feet under it and producing the kind of beef that consumers really wanted and were willing to pay the most for.